Panel is composed of 4 scholars of the modern period, modern and contemporary. Robin Greeley, who's class of 1980, as is Liz Ferrer. Both of them were from the class of 1980. Robin is a professor at UConn. Jennifer Josten from the class of 2000, who's at Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh. Kathryn O'Rourke, class of 2002, from Trinity University in San Antonio. And Beth Merfish, class of 2005, at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. And the last 3, Jennifer, Kathryn, and Beth, were all my former thesis students. So I'm very, very proud to have them all here today. So.
So our panel talked a little bit, we had one conversation before this, and decided to go in sort of chronological order, not based on our graduation dates, but based on the work that we're doing. So I get to be first. Excuse me. The commonality that we all have seems to be that we're all thinking about Latin American art through the lens in some way of politics, and I think politics writ large. So we hope you see that commonality. Our plan is to each present a short paper. I think we'll all be reading as well to stick to time, and then afterwards to have some time for discussion and questions. So my presentation today concerns the political activities of the Mexican painter Dr. Adèle, who was born Gerardo Murillo during the Second World War. But before I talk about that, I wanted to ask you to indulge a very short personal reflection, because returning here and considering my career thus far have made me particularly grateful for the influence of Jay and Wellesley and the Davis Museum. The very first art history research paper I wrote was on this print for a class that Jay co-taught with Professor Adèle. And looking back, I told Jay I was very nervous when I wrote this paper, because the paper that I wrote before this was a formal analysis, his critique of which was just one word, which was oops. So I remember being very anxious when I wrote this paper. But when I look back, I see my study of this image as a crucial point in my consideration of the interaction between visual arts and political action. That exploration was then enhanced by Pat Berman's course on propaganda and persuasion, and by my senior thesis, also involving Mendez, advised by Pat and Jay in 2005. 8 years later, I defended a dissertation with related subject matter. And in between those two things, I had the extraordinary opportunity to work for Marianne Martin and learn from Marianne Martin in her gallery. Marianne's also a Seven Sister alum, so she's sort of honorary Wellesley here. In large part because Jay recommended me to Marianne. So the work I present today is a continuation of my interest in World War II Mexico City. It is an exploration of the other side of the coin of scholarship concerning anti-fascism in the arts. I focus today on the intersection between pro-fascist advocacy and visual arts. As I do so, I feel particularly fortunate to have received my earliest training as an art historian from scholars who so carefully and successfully balanced object-based analysis with revelatory historical context and insightful application of theoretical frameworks. That balance is one I continue to strive to strike in both my pedagogy and my scholarship. The Mexican painter Dr. Adèle is best known for his contributions to landscape painting in Mexico and for his erratic political engagements, characterized by advocacy for stances both far right and far left. As an instructor at the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes in the first decade of the 20th century, Adèle fomented a student movement which culminated in the creation of the Escuelas al Aire Libre, and advocated for government recognition of the importance of funding the creation and exhibition of Mexican art, resulting in a major exhibition through which critics proclaimed a renaissance of Mexican art. From 1914 to 1916, Adèle served as director of the ENBA. His painting career has been the subject of countless exhibitions and scholarly texts. His devotion to landscape and to the development of the medium of autocolor, a thick, paint-like material made from ingredients such as oil, wax, and resin, are prominent in celebrations of his career. His most famous political engagement, his fierce advocacy for Nazi policies during the Second World War, is also the most difficult to understand. Scholars have grappled for a way to reconcile what they see as a conflict between Adèle's painting and his fascist advocacy without success. Some have created a false separation between the two. This is a strategy decried by scholar and critic Cuauhtémoc Medina in his brief review of the monographic Dr. Adèle Retrospective Exhibition of 2012. Medina succinctly argued that the exhibition's separation of Adèle's work from his politics was myopic, noting that one cannot consider, for example, the implications of Adèle's post-war work without considering his motivations as a then stigmatized political figure. His critique is relevant. In the catalog for that exhibition, this text, Los Judíos sobre América, is mentioned as part of Adèle's production of that period without any additional commentary. Other scholars, assuming Adèle the esteemed artist to be distinct from and contradictory to the Nazi advocate, have attempted to supply him with an escape from the full implications of his advocacy. The exhibition catalog for the major 1985 Adèle retrospective advances the narrative that Adèle saw Adolf Hitler first and foremost as an artist, and believed that painters themselves were best prepared to govern. This is a view Adèle did suggest, but it does not fully explain his embrace of the virulent anti-Semitism that characterizes his writing. Scholar Beatriz Espejo has pursued another strategy and attempted to make a connection between Adèle's fascism and his paintings. She writes that some paintings of the period have notably severe tones, perhaps influenced by Nazi preference for neoclassicism. Indeed, in the paintings she names, one of which you see here, there is a hard-edged quality and a dependence on line otherwise less evident in Adèle's work, but this connection is otherwise and more profoundly unsatisfying. Given the prolific nature of Adèle's production of pro-fascist texts during the war, and his equally prolific painting production, how can a hint of more structure in the artist's painting style be the only sign of the inevitable creep between his image and text production? Further, the focus on these formal qualities limits Adèle's right-wing politics to a short-lived stage that only marginally impacts his, it is assumed, more impactful work as a painter. These strategies seem to derive from a commonly held, but not often analyzed assumption, that one cannot be both a Nazi sympathizer and an important artist, particularly one deeply involved with the painting renaissance that followed the Mexican Revolution. That the conflict exists seems to be verified by the work of well-known Nazi artists, often considered servile and propagandistic, created almost exclusively in support of the Third Reich. Adèle is distinct. His landscapes, his revolutionary techniques, and his subjects were ostensibly separate from his fascist advocacy, and yet that he applied such considerable energy to both simultaneously compels a study of the ways in which they overlap. I examine the artist as fascist through two primary means: the application of Adèle's long-established artistic and personal philosophies to his fascist worldview, and his use of images and visuality in making his pro-fascist and anti-Semitic arguments. The major documents I employ are Adèle's own writings, beginning with the articles he wrote as a young man in Paris, going to the copious pamphlets, newspaper articles, and books he published during the Second World War. For today's purposes, I'll also ask another related question, which is how can we evaluate Adèle if we recognize his pro-fascist activity as just as definitive for him as his painting was? In 1911, Adèle traveled to Paris, where he had studied earlier in his life, and became a contributor to this journal. The artist espoused a belief in aristocracy, a movement advocating life spent in the service of art, and rejected commercialization. Adèle was particularly critical of the market, which he believed reduced the artist to the role of an employee. His Adèle colors, by contrast, he explained as a step away from the market and towards innovation, an alternative to oil painting, which was in heavy demand. His work at the time, he said, manifested his attempts to innovate not for market's sake, but for the sake of beauty, aesthetic rhythm, and individual self-expression. The artist the aristocrats believed was most pure, effective, and aesthetically successful when he escaped market pressures and outside influence. Adèle took this idea further, proclaiming artists superior to all of their peers, and in Paris, beginning to conceive of an international city of the arts, a utopian dream city which would be led by artists alone. Adèle was then advocating, or at least imagining, a government of individualists aligned with principles of anarchy, which he saw as synonymous with and necessary for artistic freedom. Upon his 1914 return to Mexico, Adèle joined the new government. At the same time that he led the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes, he developed his ideas of anarchism further, until the conflict between the government and himself culminated in his self-imposed exile in the United States until 1920, when he returned to Mexico and began a more private life. Even during the period when he operated as the director of the National Art School, Adèle termed himself an enemy of academic institutions and posited that shutting the school down entirely would be of benefit, evoking strains of his consistent interest in a kind of artistic anarchy. This belief in entirely individualistic art production then informed Adèle's pursuit of two solitary painted themes, landscape and self-portraiture. When in 1933 he wrote in an essay, quote, "I wasn't born a painter, I was born a wanderer, and hiking has led me to love nature and the desire to portray it." Adèle applied an aristocratic philosophy to his life, claiming that he did not paint as a result of his training or as a profession, but was rather compelled to paint as inspired by his solitary pastime. In other words, Adèle remained consistent in his advocacy for artistic independence. How, then, could he so enthusiastically embrace a role as a propaganda agent of a totalitarian state? Given the historiography of this time, it is important to establish the fervor of his pro-Nazi activities. During the Second World War, Adèle wrote at a furious pace, publishing at least 9 books. In advertisements included at the beginning of each book, Adèle wrote that he had initiated the series in 1915 and returned to it only recently. The text, then, by his own admission, manifests a single theme and a lifelong belief of the artist. The broad World War II literature echoes the tone of his Parisian essays, in which Adèle decried the art market as a capitalist tool that only stifled artists. He was a frequent contributor to the newspaper La Réaction. Some of his articles for that newspaper were then compiled and published in book form. La Réaction also published some original content in book form, as is the case with Los Judíos sobre America, labeled as Volume 1, A Study of Judaic Penetration in the USA and Mexico, its extent, its consequences, its similarities with other countries. In that text, the terms of Adèle's profound distrust of what he believes to be a vast Jewish governmental conspiracy echo those of his earlier critiques of cultural institutions. He provides as his supposed proof of this conspiracy a profile photo of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, arguing that the president had the prominent nose and coloring of a Sephardic Jew. And I'm just comparing this. We'll get to the image on the left in just a moment, but I think you can probably see the parallel here. In subsequent chapters, he conflates entirely the terms communist and capitalist, claiming the American government to be both as a result of its domination by Jews. This is not Adèle's innovation, of course, evidence of some kind of wildly individualistic artistic mind. Instead, he was parroting myths he had seen before. His writings are part of the legacy of the fraudulent anti-Semitic text, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Henry Ford had sponsored a printing of 500,000 copies of the Protocols in English in the 1920s. Adèle perhaps read one of those copies or the texts it inspired, maybe even those by his fellow Nazi advocate in Mexico, José Vasconcelos, who had overtly praised the Protocols and credited Ford directly. Adèle also seemed to be following a script set up by the Nazi propaganda machine, a quietly distributed manual for anti-Jewish propaganda written by the German government in the early 1940s, warned adherents to avoid discussions of genealogy at all costs, but then made one exception for Roosevelt, noting an infiltration, as they wrote, of Jewish blood in his family, with the result that Roosevelt's mother was supposedly a 7th-generation Jew. Adèle's reliance on images of Roosevelt was by no means novel, as is demonstrated by the cartoons like the one shown here, but it is significant that the artist chose to make the argument entirely visually, based on stereotypes and Roosevelt's facial profile. This is only one example of many contained within the volumes Adèle published during the Second World War. We get some sense of how thoroughly he came to be associated with La Réaction in this elaborate calavera by leftist printmaker Rael Anguiano, part of the current Davis exhibition, in which Adèle, who you see I've given you a detail of there on the right, seen as a monkey on top of a barrel organ, pinches his nose as a personification of La Réaction defecates above him. The poem associated with Adèle below proclaims him a Nazi master and a bad painter, ruined by La Réaction. Since reading Adèle's pro-Nazi texts and confronting the hatred he espoused, I've struggled to determine how to teach his paintings. Can we separate the work from the artist? Can we understand Adèle's contributions to painting as distinct from his political activities? It's a question I see frequently asked in other contexts today. The Me Too movement evokes similar deliberations, as any fan of Woody Allen movies or The Cosby Show will know. Architectural history is examining Philip Johnson, the son of a Wellesley grad, and himself an avowed and then in part repentant agent of Nazism in the United States, grapple with this as well. As scholars, we are sometimes discouraged from passing judgment on the non-aesthetic decisions of our subjects. One reader of my dissertation, very memorably, critiqued my work by commenting, quote, "You write as though Nazis are always bad." It sounds funny to our ears, but it's also a reminder of a kind of standard of scholarly distance we are expected to uphold, whether positive or not. In Adèle's case, I would offer additional criteria for evaluation. Adèle can and should be judged based on his own standards. He was an artist and thinker who believed strongly in the fully independent artist. He was also an artist and thinker who chose to be an unoriginal mouthpiece for a totalitarian regime, enthusiastically and devotedly parroting falsehoods, and then, as Medina notes, shifting his focus away from that mission at a time when it was clear it was a failure, by throwing himself into his next well-known project, the documentation of the new volcano Paricutin. The work he completed after the war must be understood as that of an artist who had betrayed his own core creative values and was now decisively turning away from that betrayal without acknowledging it. It is imperative that we see Adèle thusly, not as a purist with a slight deviation.
Good afternoon. Hi. I'm Kathryn O'Rourke. I want to thank the Davis Museum and Wellesley College for putting together this 2 days, this amazing event, and of course this incredible exhibition. And of course a very special thanks to Jay for being the brain behind all of it and the great glue that has brought us all together here. I have to say I am, as I so often am when I ever have a contact with Wellesley, even like just getting the alumni magazine in the mail, I am just so humbled to be part of this group, to have these women be part of the sort of larger universe. So thank you. So I am an architectural historian, and most of what I work on doesn't usually go in museums. But in the spirit of celebrating a great exhibition and Wellesley, and also being on a panel on Mexican art where we're talking about politics, I'm going to talk about walls as the theme that connects a sort of bird's eye view of some of my research. When I was a student here, I took one class in the art department that was not about architectural history. It was Jay's course, Public Art Across the Border. We talked mostly about Mexican muralism, but also about other politically charged wall-like works, including Tilted Arc and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I had arrived at Wellesley already fascinated by Mexico, but here discovered architectural history in courses with Alice Friedman, Jim O'Gorman, and Peter Ferguson. My career as a historian of Mexican architecture actually began in this room, right before the screening of a film that some of you probably know, Un banquete en Tlapayac. For some reason, as a sophomore, I picked this moment to say to Jay, with whom I had not yet taken the class, that I wanted to write a senior thesis on Mexican architecture. Seemingly unfazed by my unorthodox timing, and with his usual generosity, Jay said, "Great, you should write about Juan O'Gorman's houses for artists and intellectuals." And that's the Diego Rivera house right there by Juan O'Gorman, and come to Mexico City at winter session. So O'Gorman's house in the studio for Rivera became the star of my thesis, and many years later the subject of one of the chapters in my book, which deals a lot with the importance of facades in Mexican modernism. That book also includes a chapter on the house of Luis Barragán, who is, of course, most celebrated for his walls. Whether they were pink or red or white, high or low, glazed or curtained, pierced by many openings or none, Barragán's walls at once enveloped him in a private world, very different from the public one that O'Gorman and Rivera addressed. From behind walls that were apparently apolitical and sufficiently unornamented to suit the tastes of an international elite, Barragán created the distinctive photogenic buildings that came to be seen outside of Mexico as paradigmatic of the so-called Mexicanization of modern architecture. I learned to analyze houses here within the perfectly contextual modern walls of the Jewett Art Center designed by Paul Rudolph, Barragán's contemporary and fellow master of architectural sleights of hand. My reading of Barragán grew in large measure from what I learned within Rudolphian spaces from Alice Friedman, who knows more about modernism and domesticity than anyone in the world. Abstract, massive, and responsive to a context vastly greater in scale than the one Rudolph found at Wellesley, Alberto Arai's 1952 Hialeah courts at the campus of the National Autonomous University of Mexico Mexico were set against mountains in the manner of the great ancient cities of Mexico. And these became a real fascination for me in the course of writing my book and what I'm going to talk about for a while here. Recalling the reaction of a U.S. architect to the courts, architect Jose Villagran Garcia recalled that the visitor waited, horrified, half expecting to see warm human blood trickling down the walls. The effect was altogether different than that created by Barragan's planar manipulations, but Mexicans and foreigners alike admired Arai's courts for their geometric clarity and abstraction. They marveled at the ways the volcanic rock-clad inclines evoked Mesoamerican temples. And the building's formal and symbolic charge came, of course, from their materials, their relationship to the site, and the ways they seemed to reposition the viewer in relationship to landscape and history. In his theoretical writings, Arai articulated an approach to Mexican architectural history and modern design centered on an empathic experience of ancient works and a very modern appreciation of abstraction. Working at the same time that Octavio Paz wrote The Labyrinth of Solitude, and as Gunter Gerso painted his historically evocative, abstract, planar compositions, Arai claimed that Mesoamerican buildings might shape 20th century psychological experience just as they had historically played roles in defining what he called Mexico's psycho-historical process. The country's indigenous architecture was, he said, quote, the most ancient and elemental, the most distant and the most healthy. But it also contained the germs of something profoundly unsettling for modern people. Seizing on the experience of viewing ancient buildings, Arai suggested that at the core of a distinctive national architectural theory was the modern viewer's perception of the unfamiliar in ancient Mesoamerican architecture and awareness of her or his own distance from the culture that created it. That viewer's encounter with the rare, the strange, and the foreign, and the resulting sense of surprise and disorientation was born from the confusing experience of being in close physical proximity to the buildings, but not apprehending them fully. Arai was fascinated by the moments in which a viewer became aware of the gap between the proximate and the past, indeed, in the relationship between place and time. In 1949, Arai had participated in an expedition to the recently uncovered Maya temples at Bonampak, deep in the Yucatan jungle, where he drew the buildings and began to explore the ideas that later informed his work at UNAM. Although other Maya sites were more impressive architecturally and urbanistically, Bonampak had perhaps the best preserved and most extraordinary murals in all of ancient Mexico. Like others, Arai marveled at their realism, vitality, and the ways that they brought the Maya, as individuals and as a culture, vividly to life. At Bonampak, he found evidence that, like modern architects, the Maya prized formal rigor, linear clarity, plasticity, and were concerned with the relationship of the figure to space. In 2 essays written after his work there, he proposed a theory of the origin of Mesoamerican temples that linked them to the preeminent symbol of Mexican culture, the Western architectural notion of the primitive hut, and to a modernist focus on geometry and pure form. According to Arai, the pyramid, with its platforms and sloped walls, began with the making of tortillas and the architect's experience of watching his mother shape masa into spheres and then flatten them into circular forms to be cooked. Arai claimed that the making of tortillas was represented mentally in the conscience of the artist, reproduced and revived. Watching this process stimulated the artist to imagine the formal transformation of a sphere into a trapezoid. Smaller spheres might be stacked atop larger ones to create the successively smaller forms in stepped pyramids. The architect's creation myth, which was really no more or less absurd than the better-known 18th century one by Marc-Antoine Laugier, and this is the famous frontispiece that all architectural historians of Europe know about, centered on materiality, association, and subjective experience. Arai explained that the artistic will of the adult sculptor came to have its roots in retrospective sentiment, and said that the seed of this primary emotion took shape in a material, became fixed, truly impressed on the infant soul when the eyes of the child saw the daily making of tortillas. Although it began in the kitchen, the ultimate work of these talud walls, Arai argued, was to shape urban form and soften the contrast between the work of architecture and the landscape. For him, the inclined plane embodied the fusion of the utilitarian and artistic in the service of shaping a public realm and facilitating connection to nature. In a characteristically modernist plea for totality, he claimed that the sloping wall differentiated and separated spaces at the same time that it united and connected them, establishing distinctions between constructive masses and different dimensions, and at once including them in a total conception. Ultimately, he proposed that modern cosmopolitan viewers' consciousness of their historical and cultural distance from ancient Maya architects, awakened when beholding temples and murals, might inspire them to interrogate their experiences of class and racial differences in modern life, and from there encourage them to forge a new, more egalitarian order. And I should say he had been a quite committed communist throughout his life. Grounded in a humanistic faith in the transformative power of art and a deep responsiveness to history, his was the most sophisticated theorization of architecture of the relationship between Mexico's indigenous past and mestizo present that had long captivated artists, intellectuals, and filmmakers. The architect's implication in his built work that the experience of estrangement provoked by contact with seemingly, but not actually, ancient works of architecture, that might be the means to forging a more humanistic world, has inspired the ideas at the core of my current research on walls, which crosses Mexican borders. In the 1930s, at his home and studio, Taliesin West in Arizona, Frank Lloyd Wright reworked the principles of ancient American planning and created some of the century's most impressive walls, massive works of concrete into which he placed spectacular boulders and positioned in relation to the desert landscape. Visitors to Wright's desert camp frequently remarked on how strange it was, simultaneously ancient seeming and yet of its time. The building embodied Wright's theory of organic architecture, which imagined that a return to the fundamental principles of building and living in and with nature would support the emergence of a truly free and democratic society. Profound distrust of capitalism, concern for the poor, and hope that art might be a tool to resist the worst effects of the former and support the latter, informed the designs of a very different group of American walls. About the same time that Rudolph was building in brick here at Wellesley, outside of Montevideo in the town of Atlántida, Eladio Dieste created some of the hemisphere's most spectacular walls and vaults at the Church of Christ the Worker. Although their power came from the ways they shaped interior space rather than from the intimate connection to landscape, Dieste's walls, like those by Arai and Wright, used what I term formal archaism as an expression of a theoretical humanism. Defined by minimally reinforced conodial undulations, his church reinterpreted an ancient building type, using inexpensive materials and complex geometries to awaken memory and even the subconscious, in an architectural language that might be intelligible across borders of class and income. Speaking of the church, Dieste recalled being, quote, reassured by the comprehension shown by a very humble woman, with her coarse shoes covered in mud. The itinerary that she followed, the places where she paused, the things that she said with complete simplicity and without accolades, these things made me realize that she really was seeing it. She did not see the complex conscious intentions, but rather the shape in which these had taken form. Architecture's inherent abstraction makes its politics less visible than it sometimes is in Mexican art. The works of three architects in three countries with three very different kinds of walls collectively show a shared exploration of and even aspirational response to the intellectual and aesthetic problems that emerged at mid-century, particularly as they concerned capitalism and the global reach of the military-industrial complex. More prosaically, although of great interest to me, together the buildings point to the ways that an important period in modern architectural history might begin to be reframed, and are suggestive of the ways that we might begin to write a truly international history of architecture. As a professor in San Antonio, living and working 150 miles from the Rio Grande, I now teach a class called Public Art Across the Border, based in part on my old Wellesley syllabus. Unlike in any semester heretofore, this spring, the students and I are grappling with the meaning of walls, built and imagined. As an architectural historian, I am haunted by the pseudo-architectural character of the would-be one at the border and its meaning in the real South Texas landscape. In proper Wellesley fashion, I feel compelled to work through these issues with my students. It was at Wellesley, of course, that I first learned the meaning of landscape. And while I have yet to find any humanism in a border wall, it just looks archaic, I take some comfort in the enduring power and essential optimism of the humanistic inquiry, which I first learned here and now have the privilege of passing on. Thank you.
I certainly second Kathryn and others in speaking to the humility with which I take this podium for the first time, the podium behind which I heard my first art history lecture ever, having arrived here at the age of still 17, knowing, without ever having had an art history class, that that was what I should do and why I should come to Wellesley. And so to be here now and to see my former professors in the audience, to be a part of this project that Jay has put together, that so encapsulates the teaching mission that he has so generously shared with me, with Ellen, with Beth, with Kathryn, and with so many other students is incredibly moving. So thank you to the Davis and to Wellesley for this opportunity. So here I'm showing two works that I focus on in my research and in my teaching at the University of Pittsburgh. They were both made in Mexico during the Cold War in response to very different circumstances. Like Ellen, Beth, and Kathryn, my career as a historian of Mexican art and design began here at Wellesley and in Jay's classes, but the path took me in some other directions first, and I'd like to revisit those as a way to trace how the interests that were fostered here continue to shape and inform my work as an art historian. My research focus is on how artists, architects, and intellectuals in mid-20th century Mexico contributed to international movements, and on how their activities were deeply inflected by the broader geopolitical alignments of the Cold War. The roots of this interest lie in the classes I took on Latin American politics with Lois Wasserspring in the political science department here, and in Latin American studies, of which I was a double major, and in Jay's lectures, in which I was most intrigued by the post-revolutionary public art of Mexico, such as Diego Rivera's monumental frescoes of the 1920s. During a semester abroad in Bolivia, I carried out a study of that nation's post-revolutionary mural movement, which arose in the 1950s, and which was directly inspired by the Mexican phenomenon. When it came time to decide on a senior thesis, however, Jay and Lois encouraged me to follow my interest in Cold War-era revolutionary art to Cuba, to explore why it was that the exemplary political art form of that nation's communist revolution of 1959, which played such a vital role in what some scholars refer to now as the long 1960s, was not the mural, but the poster. Here we see two examples of Cuban revolutionary posters, both of which were designed and produced for OSPAL, the Organization for Solidarity with the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which was founded in Havana in 1966. Somehow, I obtained a license from the US Treasury Department to travel alone to Cuba. We later learned it was only supposed to be for graduate students, but they hadn't paid close enough attention to Wellesley College. I spent 2 months in Havana speaking with poster designers, most of whom are no longer alive, and seeking documentation of the development of Cuba's strikingly flexible, eclectic, and cosmopolitan revolutionary art, material that quickly came to define not only the first decade of Cuba's revolution, but the ethos of 60s political protest culture around the world. In the course of this research, I learned that OSPAL distributed posters such as these around the world by folding them into every issue of their magazine, Tricontinental, or Tricontinental. I chose these 2 OSPAL posters to show you today because I distinctly remember discussing them both in the first public research presentation I ever gave at the Ruhlman Conference here on campus in the Science Center in the spring of 2000. Both of them feature Alberto Corda's famous 1960 photograph of Che Guevara, as does, in a different way, Liliana Porter's work, which is on the cover of the catalog for Art Latin America. But they employ it in very different ways, thus characterizing the diversity of Cuba's revolutionary posters as a whole. Michael Casey and others have written about the remarkable life of this iconic photograph, which only began to circulate following Che's assassination in 1967 in rural Bolivia, another scene on the walls in Art Latin America, in Freddy Alberto's photograph, which was, of course, when Guevara was seeking to foment continental revolution. Both of these posters were made to commemorate October 8, the day of Guevara's death, which was declared the day of the heroic guerrilla. In the poster on the left, designed by Elena Serrano, Corda's image radiates out from the heart of South America like a shockwave, suggesting that the spirit and aims of his South American campaign did not die with him, but continued and continue, indeed, to reverberate throughout the region. In Lázaro Abreu's poster on the right, Corda's image of Che is integrated into an image of a royal Inca poncho suspended from a rifle. Here, again, the incorporation of Che's image into a South American symbol, now one tied specifically to resistance to colonial domination in the Andes, proclaims that his commitment to insurrectionist efforts in the region did not die with him, but continues to be led by his example. I remember how, in the course of helping me prepare my Ruhlman Conference talk, I believe it may have been the night before, Jay pointed out with excitement that the designer had very intentionally substituted Corda's image of Che for the checkerboard squares of the Inca poncho, of which these are miniature versions of the black, white, and red ponchos that were worn by the Inca military and symbolize the power of the Sapa Inca. This gives us a sense of the extremely deliberate design choices made by Cuba's revolutionary artists to generate this kind of continental and international solidarity. But how, you might be wondering, do we get from these Cuban posters dealing with South American themes to recent scholarship on modern Mexico, the subject of our panel? Well, it was en route to Havana to research these posters that I first saw Rivera's murals and other great works of modern Mexican art and architecture in person, when Jay suggested that I stop in Mexico City on the way to meet Cuban emigre designers and art historians for my thesis research. 3 summers later, I would return, again thanks to him, as a research assistant for an exhibition about the deep connections between Mexico City and Los Angeles in the 20th century. Though that research didn't immediately turn into an exhibition, we both returned to it more than a decade later as part of the curatorial advisory team for the LACMA exhibition, Found in Translation, Design in California and Mexico, 1915 to 1985, in 2017, for which I focused on Cold War-era posters once again, now examining how commercial designers had used strong diagonals, mountains, and twinkling lights to represent these 2 capitals of sprawl. This work is connected to the research that I did for my dissertation and for my recent book on the artist Matthias Gerets. This was research that was carried out at Yale and in Mexico, as well as other archives in Europe and the United States in the intervening years. And at the core of this research is the rise of abstract, monumental, modernist art and design in Cold War Mexico, of which the iconic example is the Torres de Ciudad Satélite, the towers of Satellite City. These are 5 hollow, wedge-shaped forms built from reinforced painted concrete on a median in the center of a highway 9 miles northwest of downtown Mexico City. They were designed in 1957 by the German émigré artist Matthias Geritz and architect Luis Barragan to serve as the physical place marker, entrance plaza, and marketing logo for a commercial real estate development, a fully laid out, self-sufficient city for a maximum of 200,000 residents, complete with its own shops, schools, and churches. At the time the towers were built, this city outside of the city was only a concept, 2,000 acres that had been cleared for speculative real estate development, with the towers and a large tool shed, the only structures visible for miles around. This was in the midst of a period of dramatic industrialization and urbanization. Between 1940 to 1960, Mexico City's population would expand from 1.5 million to 5 million. While Arrai's Hayalai courts, for which Kathryn loaned me her image, and other buildings were being built at the Ciudad Universitaria to the south of Mexico City, skyscrapers were going up in the historic center, as we see on the right. Within this context, the towers were a giant promissory note for modern urban development in Mexico. Within a few decades, Ciudad Satélite would be absorbed into the fabric of the megalopolis, and urbanism would bring the elevated billboards, additional lanes, and pedestrian access bridges that alter the visual approach to and from the towers today. And yet, the experience of passing them in movement has not altered dramatically since 5 decades ago, it seems to me. As one approaches from the south, the apparently regular geometric triangular towers flatten into thin walls of primary colors and white that shift quickly in and out of view. From the other side of the road, they appear to be regular 4-sided towers or giant signposts leading the way toward the city that served for centuries as Mexico's political and economic center. Soon after their completion in 1958, these hollow, painted, prismatic towers would come to represent not only the entity for which they were constructed, but modern Mexico City, and indeed modern Mexico as a whole. They were and are both captured by architectural photographers, as we see here, and appropriated by commercial artists as emblems of the period of rapid modernization, expansion, and urban development in which they were built. While Geritz and Barragan's towers might seem the opposite of the Cuban posters with which I began, I've come to realize that the methodology driving my work at Wellesley, the focus on how, in the context of the global Cold War, modern design elements and artistic styles traveled and were adapted to new political contexts, something that we saw modeled masterfully earlier by Jeanette Peterson and Claire Farrago in their papers about local implications of global flows, is also at the heart of my work on the rise and circulation of abstract alternatives to state-sponsored realism in mid-century Mexico. Indeed, to bring it full circle, my current book project returns to the posters from my thesis, situating them in the broader regional ecosystem in which they participated. I'm now aware of how posters such as Alfredo Rosgard's silk-screened Bleeding Rose, which fuses beauty and pain like a great protest song would, traveled from Havana to Mexico City, where it graced the cover of El Corno Emplumado, Margaret Randall and Sergio Mondragon's bilingual poetry journal of the Americas in the 1960s. I see a strong formal connection to Rosgard's poignant pop design in Jesus Martinez's silkscreen poster from Mexico's '68 student and worker movement. In the wake of the state-sponsored massacre on October 2 of 1968, 50 years ago, and 10 days before the opening of the Mexico City Olympics, Martinez took designer Lance Wyman's pop-style Dove of Peace, which itself was an appropriation of the international communist symbol, and which blanketed Mexico City for its hosting of the 1968 Olympics, as we see here, and he pierced it with the bayonet of state-sponsored repression, drawing blood, just as Rosgard would. Finally, I've been thinking about how these powerful political designs from Cuba and Mexico reached members of the Chicano and Black Power movements in California, or, as we might think of it, Greater Mexico, where designers such as Rupert Garcia, who's represented not once but twice in Art Latin America, adapted and extended these graphic approaches for other purposes and sent them back into circulation. The project, then, is not only to chart the movements of these motifs within the international anti-imperialist map of the long 1960s, but to introduce them to my students at the University of Pittsburgh. General education students as much or more than art history majors and PhD students, I would note. Across the board, some of them recognize in these possibilities for disrupting ideological circuits in our own moment, which is also so marked by image saturation and high political tensions. So, thank you. With that, I turn the microphone over to Robin to speak on the contemporary.
Thank you. Now, I'm not a Jay student. Jay is more of a fellow traveler. In the late 1970s, when I was at Wellesley, Latin American art history wasn't an option because Jay wasn't here. So rather, it was from history professor Jonathan Knudsen that I got my first insights into Marx, Kant, and I remember with the especial vividity that shock produces, the Marquis de Sade. Under Professor Knudsen's tutelage, I began an engagement with Marxism that has informed my scholarship on art and politics ever since. And Professor Knudsen died too young. He died in 1999. And I'd like to dedicate this talk on art and social justice in Mexico today to him. So the call for a socially transformative art lodged in a model of ethical responsibility is, of course, nothing new, as we've seen all today. It has been at the center of the fraught but productive entanglement of art and politics in Mexico, well, basically from forever. But it has been a focus of renewed concern for contemporary art in the struggle to define art's responsibility in an age of global finance capitalism that relentlessly annihilates even the most infinitesimal spaces of critique. So one contemporary response has been to think of artistic production as a type of militant research that combines the long history of anti-art antagonism towards the institutions of art with a distinctively contemporary anti-capitalist activism. The activist aesthetics produced under this rubric, such as Rexistes, guerrilla art activism, or Rue des Femmes, street performances against femicide, often appear to leave behind the category of art altogether, seeking to circumvent the tentacles of an art market fully complicit in today's predatory forms of capital accumulation. And this model locates the responsibility of art, its ethical turn, in eradicating the ontological distinction between art and not art. That is the foundation of the institutionalized concept of art. In this model, argues Tom Hollert, the responsibility of art is to get rid of itself. Only by forsaking the category of art in favor of direct political action can art avoid being co-opted by the very powers it seeks to resist. Others, such as Nestor Garcia Canclini, Claire Bishop, and Cuauhtemoc Medina, resist this effort to jettison the category of art. They argue, albeit from rather different positions within that framework, that the political potential of art relies on what you could call the productive contradiction of art's relationship to social change, characterized by that paradox of belief in art's autonomy and in its being inextricably bound to the promise of a better world to come. And I want to look today at three brief examples, very brief. There are many, many, many from which one could choose, but three examples of these disparate attitudes towards an art of social justice in Mexico today. And I want to concentrate especially on art, contemporary art that deals with the rise of violence around the narco wars and corruption. So my first example is Ayotzinapa. On September 26, 2014, a group of students from a rural school in Ayotzinapa in the south state of Guerrero were attacked by local and federal police. Several students were killed outright, and the police abducted 43 others, handing them over to a local drug cartel for assassination. Although just one incident among many in the rampant violence unleashed by Mexico's drug wars, this incident, for vast swaths of the Mexican citizenry, the Ayotzinapa disappearances were the straw that broke the camel's back. Massive protests ensued, popular demonstrations led by university students and the families, especially, of the Ayotzinapa disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of protesters synchronized a national physical occupation of public space with a transnational virtual occupation of media space, so as to bring serious national and international pressure to bear on the Mexican state. In so doing, they succeeded in opening up a contestatory breach in the midst of the existing order of representation in both the visual and the political senses of the term. Aesthetics played a central role in all of this, against both the drug cartel's attempts to use the power of images to instill fear and against the state's efforts to silence dissent through official spectacle. Protesters used aesthetics to reclaim a public ethics of citizenship, developing image strategies that both documented their situation and proposed a collective civic politics. Whereas the Ayotzinapa protests aesthetics overwhelmingly left behind the institutions of art in favor of direct political action. My next two examples gain much of their power from their dialogue with the history and institutions of art. So my second example, the artist who goes by the name of Maurice. For Maurice, the point of entry into confronting the epistemological chill imposed by the dehumanizing horror of Mexico's narco-violence must be through analyzing its signifying representational codes in tension with the procedures of contemporary art. The artist engages in a set of post-conceptualist tactics that sieve the shock images of narco-violence through a rigorous procedural aesthetics intended to decrypt the concentric levels of linguistic codes on which they depend, from narcomensajes delivered not just on narcomantas, but more insidiously via the dismembered bodies of victims, to the nota roja mediatized spectacle in the guise of news reporting. Morris probes what political philosopher Adriana Caballero terms horrorism, relying on an ever-proliferating repertoire of atrocities, dismemberment, massacres, torture, beheadings. Horrorism enacts an insidious logic aimed at destroying the very personhood of the victims, a violence that, not content merely to kill, because killing would be too little, aims to destroy the human condition itself. In the face of these violencias, argues Rosana Reguillo, language fails, exhausting itself in its attempt to produce an explanation or a reason. In series materials, which is a subsection of this larger series that Maurice did, Maurice gestures towards this representational inadequacy, even as he gives visual form to it. On a blank white page, the artist affixes not the image of the tortured body itself, but the trappings and equipment associated with that torture. And then my third example, Teresa Margaux. Margaux' aesthetics consistently focus on the social violence revealed by death, using her experience as a forensic technician in Mexico City's morgue to probe the brutality structurally inherent in contemporary society. Early on with her group Semefo, she worked with human remains directly, using such procedures as indexicality and seriality to engage in an unorthodox interchange with the languages of contemporary art. So, for example, in referencing Yves Klein's anthropometries, works such as Dermis disturbingly probe the legacies of the avant-garde and neo-avant-garde through the lens of extreme social marginalization. From the late 1990s onward, Margaux extended Semefo's practice, stripping it of its romantic, decadent overtones and investing it with a political critique of the social crises loosed by Mexico's turn towards neoliberalism. Margaux traced both the savagery of social inequalities that extended beyond life into death and institutional complicity in generating the local conditions of violence, producing a potent critique of, as she calls it, a society in which violence is almost a habit. In 2009, Margaux represented Mexico at the Venice Biennale with this installation work, What Else Could We Talk About? And the installation extended, again, Margaux' post-conceptualist aesthetics of bodily abjection beyond the morgue to a wider critique of the intersection of violence and the world economy as epitomized by the Mexican narco wars. Through a series of actions, engagements, and material works utilizing objects such as shattered glass and blood-soaked clothes found at sites of drug-related killings, Margaux somberly chronicled the catastrophic effects of a global social system fundamentally rooted in treating entire segments of the population as expendable. Now, I want to conclude by recalling Theodor Adorno's famous maxim, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." Adorno's phrase remains irresistible to us today, writes Steve Stern, because it seems to distill our predicament, the burden of living with the legacy of regimes of organized violence so massive and extreme, yet so closely associated with modernity that they overwhelm our capacity to narrate or comprehend them. In the aftermath of such violence, Adorno seems to say, artistic expression is inadequate. Auschwitz, he wrote, made clear that culture had failed to its very core. Thus, to pretend that culture can redeem its own failure, he said, is an absurdity. To consider art possible is to fall into a consoling but barbaric illusion. Adorno's insight notoriously continues to prompt controversy, often at the risk of reducing the original text's nuances to a cliché. Yet when he wrote it in 1949, Adorno's aim was very historically specific, to break through post-war Germany's empty and cold forgetting, as he said, to smash its belief in a return to normalcy. Moreover, rather than simply a rejection of the possibility of art, Adorno's incendiary statement establishes a dialectic between culture and barbarism that resolutely refuses any redemptive vision of culture, while nonetheless maintaining the absolute necessity of art and culture as an uncompromising space of address to suffering. Even where he consigns all post-Auschwitz culture, including its critique, to the garbage heap, writes Klaus Hoffmann, he nevertheless insists on the urgency of this critique. Adorno holds on to this dialectic to a dialectic that stipulates the indispensability of art, the indispensability of that which it condemns. Clearly, Adorno was responding specifically to the post-war collapse of the Enlightenment project of modernity, while Mexico has followed a distinct, if still ultimately related, historical trajectory. But the point I want to emphasize is this. It is in this dialectic between culture and barbarism, a dialectic which demands the existence of art while declaring its inadmissibility, that Adorno locates what we might call a post-Auschwitz ethics. A new categorical imperative has been imposed by Hitler, he wrote, to arrange our thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself. Thank you. So we realized when we were talking with each other that, as you said, that we were spanning about a century or so of time, but that there were the theme of art and politics was really at the core throughout. And so it was, when I was thinking last night when I was still writing this paper, and somebody was bugging me for my PowerPoint out there, well, how do we think of this relationship, how do we define the terms on both sides, art and politics? And of course, what we've got are many different, is it on?
No.
Okay. So, how do we define these terms, art and politics? And what we see here is, quite a variety of definitions that are, not only super interesting in all directions, not the least of which is visual, but that really are so deeply historically contextualized. And I think that's, I really appreciate this deep contextualization, even in the short, space that we have, of these important issues. So those were some of my thoughts.
Shall we open to questions? Are there questions? Mary.
Oh, thank you for all your papers so much. I wanted to ask Beth, in looking at those caricatures of, well, I guess Aptles isn't even really a caricature, he just projects a caricature onto a photograph of Roosevelt, it reminded me that of this Posada graphic that's always struck me as very problematic. It's called A Very Tender Embrace, and it shows Uncle Sam as a Semitic caricature kind of grabbing at a Mexican woman while a peasant walks by, very mad about it, with money bags. And it reminds me that, Wright, that anti-Semitism as a sort of form of caricature is very much embedded in the Mexican context in anti-Americanism. And I'm wondering, and so I've never found, I totally appreciate your taking up Cuauhtémoc's also observation that you can't separate Aptles' work from his politics, his fascist politics. But I've never been that surprised that Aptel and Vasconcelos became fascist. In fact, it seems quite logical. It's a logical direction one could go from the kind of spiritualized nationalism that they're both participating in, and thinking through Vasconcelos' the way in which anti-Americanism frames his conception of the cosmic grace. And I'm just wondering, how does anti-Americanism play in the kind of ways that Adèle is fostering or fomenting his fascist position?
Okay. Yeah, right. So I think that's all right and well observed. I I guess I don't really know that there's a way to separate them at all. I think you're right that a lot of the anti-Americanism is based on this idea that the United States is an imperialist state, right, or is sort of exerting invisible control. And almost all of the ancient anti-Semitic myths are also based on the idea of invisible control. So I guess I don't quite know how to answer your question because I don't know how to separate them out. But I think you're right that they're part of the same idea. I tend to think that they always overlap, but that it was really Henry Ford's real vigorous defense of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and his sort of reinvigoration of that text and his translation that made that connection really tangible and apparent. I think it's around that time that you start to see those as totally inextricable, that anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism sort of go together based on that idea. I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
It's
I mean,
helpful.
I think going back to maybe Jennifer's observation about the global here, the ways in which fascism takes a sort of a local inflection, given the kind of different trajectories that anti-Americanism can produce in the Latin American context, and thinking that this is this tendency that kind of goes back a lot farther than we're comfortable. I mean, Posada is the people's hero, right? And yet there's a lot of anti-Semitism in 19th century graphic work, not commented on as far as I know in the literature, but I'm just, so it makes me, your presentation made me think about that. I always show it and I'm always like, yes, your students, you are right. This is an anti-Semitic caricature. And
Yes.
just sort of seeing it. Maybe we should be even less surprised that there's anti-Semitism in, or fascist anti-Semitism in Otto's work, given the maybe closer articulations between the construction of the national sensibility within a hemispheric political opposition to the United States.
Yeah, I think, part of what interested me about these projects, and I should say Jay suggested this strain when I was thinking about writing my dissertation. I had a conversation with him, I can still remember, he said, Vasconcelos, I think, was a Nazi. You should really look into that. So I think part of what sort of interested me was that this seemed a counter-narrative to what I had falsely imagined was a kind of inevitability of leftism, right? This sort of idea that like everyone was going to be a leftist because there was a kind of revolution and there was interest in public art, and so this meant that you were on one side of the aisle, right, when there was no aisle. And so yes, I think even as I sort of continue to read these, I'm still constantly shocked by how wrong that assumption was, and how much there was, and it certainly deserves more attention.
I was also, when you were talking, I was thinking of, not only the sort of national context of fascist sympathies in Mexico and obviously in various other places in Latin America that has, its own particular history I think it's, obviously linked to the rise of fascism in Europe, but it also has its own internal histories, but also just I was thinking, for instance, while you were talking of a photographer, I think his name is Tomás Moreno, who's a major photographer for the PAN in the late 30s and 40s, and a really interesting photographer visually, but who's coming at, he's from the PAN, which is, a Catholic right wing. But he's investigating urban poverty because the PRI isn't doing it, and so there's these contexts in which you get these really interesting, in quotations, let's say, political maneuvers, again in these reworking or these interchanges between international and then the national and the local. So super interesting.
See Jeanette with a question.
Robin, this is a question for you. I'm interested in the role that perhaps was played by religion or religious overtones in that space that aesthetics won't fill after those horrific acts of violence. And particularly with Margaux, although the women who were veiled in black had a sense of, protest that brought in spirituality. But in some of those sheets that Margaux creates, they look so much like the Shroud of Turin, where people's blood and sweat is then inked onto a large sheet, and you get the sense of a relic. And does that appear in her work, or am I over-interpreting, or?
Oh no, absolutely. That's all absolutely in there. Yeah, she riffs on lots of things. One of the interests in her work is her capacity to bring together such a wide range of symbolic references and historical and aesthetic references. Absolutely. So like I think on a lot of artists work with and activist artists too work with the role of religion transformed, through symbolic means into contemporary contexts, and that's of course something we see with muralism. You're also making me think of, I could put up so many images. One of the ones I didn't put up was the whole Pink Crosses movement. I mean, I was thinking, okay, I've got 15 minutes, what can I do? And on top of it, it's a very depressing kind of talk that I just gave. But nevertheless, I think there's some depressing stuff going on out there in the world that we need to confront. But the Pink Crosses movement is super interesting. It's a spontaneous, sort of a spontaneous grassroots, not art, just activist aesthetics of using pink crosses to mark femicidios, the killing of women, especially in the Ciudad Juarez region, but really it's spread all over the place. And somebody once asked me, well, why crosses and why pink? Isn't that just really traditional? And I said, well, okay, but it's mobilizing. It's a symbolism that reaches across wide swaths. It's legible and very visual, and can do that work of forming a kind of communal, collective response to these really unbearable violences that communities face. So there are lots of points where these kind of this imagery with such a long-standing history, but as you yourself know, which itself has an even longer history that's kind of been incorporated into things like a crucifix. Can be taken into other situations and used to encompass a kind of emotion and a sense of we've got to mobilize, we've got to come together as a collective and mobilize against this. So Margaux is using this in the art world. I mean, she's dealing with the art world, and she's very savvy about linking up those kinds of symbols through contemporary art aesthetics, but it's she's using the power of all that as well in her work as well. Yeah.
Question for Kathryn. It's a little bit of a tangent, so I apologize ahead of time. But in your work on public monuments across the border, have you looked into at all monuments to migrants?
Yeah, right. So
and that passage across the border and the danger and
this is the thing that I'm beginning to like remake public art across the border for the millionth time, right? To try to deal with some of this, because so much is coming, right? And there has been so much interesting response to this from artists in the last, even in the last 2 or 3 years as things have changed. I'm lately been doing less with the monuments per se, but actually trying to work through some of the landscape issues, as I alluded to there, again, because it's so, there's something I really think about being so close to it. I mean, this is not an abstraction for us, I was in Laredo less than a month ago, and the experience of driving from Laredo to San Antonio, which is, 2 hours, and you go through what is essentially a militarized zone already. I was stopped twice twice by the Customs and Border Patrol people not having ever entered Mexico. So I'm a little more like at this point on that kind of spatial thing. And of course, because I have students who are from the Valley and for whom, who don't breeze through, those checkpoints as easily as I do, frankly, right? That's a little bit more what we're talking about. And what this means, I've been talking to a lot of architects who are actually a really interesting firm in Laredo that are doing projects that are trying to look at ways that their attitude is like, well, yeah, give us this federal money. Come on, bring us some federal money, but we're not building you a wall. We're going to build you the best river park you can imagine, right? And we're going to fix the ways, frankly, that Interstate 35, which is the NAFTA highway, it is the biggest port of entry, right? That's where all this trade comes through. That freeway went through and just ripped the hell out of historic Laredo, which is a major historic city in this country that, almost no one, even in Texas, knows about the importance of it, right, from an architectural standpoint. So that's a little bit more where, because you know what I do, right? But how sort of the sort of urban and landscape response is what people are doing with that. Yeah.
I have a question for Jennifer. First of all, thank you all for really fascinating talks and very timely, of course. But for Jennifer, I'm really interested in thinking about your trajectory and to think about, have you found connections in your research on Cuba? Because I know the Cubans were very deeply looking at the Mexicans. When they were articulating or they were thinking about how culture was going to be part of the revolution, Mexico was most definitely the prequel for them. So I'm wondering if there was any conversation that you found, or you found any register of thinking through the Cuban graphics of OSPAL or of ICAIC or of all those institutions that were going to create a southern, south-south solidarity. Were they looking at the Taller de Gráficas Populares in Mexico? Is there any, because they take a different route, right? But they're thinking about the Mexican Revolution, and they're thinking about the culture that came out of the Mexican Revolution. And I wonder if you found any documentation of that.
There's the more one goes into the relationship between Cuba and Mexico, the more complex it becomes very quickly. This is, of course, the Nahua Spanish War, as we've discussed it this morning, began from Cuba, right, into Mexico. So a 500-year history of exchange, of contact, and very often of exchange. And this is work that Olga Rodriguez has done in multiple volumes in Mexico on this, on these exchanges in different periods. And that's something that drew me certainly back to Cuba, I suppose it drew me to Mexico, and then back to Cuba and Mexico, to think about it in these different eras. That the exchange in the 1920s and 30s between Mexico and Cuba was so strong. And that's where I think that would be the place that I would look for more exchange in terms of the Taller de Gráfica Popular. And I don't know, Beth, if this is something, the extent to which Cuba factors into 30s and 40s circuits. Whereas what's so striking about the Cuban revolutionary graphics is the way that by 1963, 64, 65, social realism has been decisively abandoned for the most part. There are still posters. There are many, many, many posters in many different styles. But those that take hold, those that are popular, are the ones that turn very definitively away from that prescribed language, which is by then, in 1963, so closely associated with Stalinism and with Maoism, although that's its own interesting dialogue. And so what's particularly striking to me about Cuba-Mexico relations in the 1960s is the close links of journalists, particularly filmmakers, publishers. Vicente Rojo, for instance, the great graphic designer of Mexico since 1950, as someone who's going to Cuba and also looking to Cuban graphics and whose graphics are getting to Cuba and circulating. So I think that's a point of exchange. There were also organizations and exhibitions of Amelia Pelaez and Raúl Martínez in Mexico, organizations for solidarity with Cuba in Mexico. The PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which I don't think we've talked much about in this panel, strikingly, the party that rules Mexico without a break from 1929 until 2000, takes in, and this is part of my book on Matthias Gerets, is looking at the way in which, drawing on Renata Keller's work, of course, your colleague, your former colleague, that the PRI uses its continued relationship to Cuba and continued recognition of Cuba to maintain a space of independence, or at least apparent autonomy, from the United States in particular at this moment, while in the background, as we've seen from the work that scholars at GW and the National Security Archives make available, indeed, Mexico is passing a lot of information about a tremendous amount of communist information about communist activities or supposed communist activities in Mexico to the CIA. So Cuba offers a cover to some extent to the PRI in the 1960s and after, as does Mexico's embrace of exiles from South America in the 1970s, particularly too, where it's possible to say, sure, we've had our problems, but those people are much worse. Right? So that's a thorny issue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.